Hi, and welcome to the Risk and Resilience Insights interviews. I'm Grant Kennedy, and we've got the pleasure to have Gordon Stewart joining us today. So thank you for joining us, Gordon. Much appreciated.
Welcome, very welcome, Grant.
Okay, well, probably what we'll start off with first is maybe if you could just give us a bit of an insight into your background, the roles that you've developed over the years, the roles that you've taken on, and we can move on from there.
Sure, thank you. So my background is probably best described as probably originally manufacturing, then projects, and then latterly it's been airports for the best part of 12 years of my career. And probably worth mentioning where I got introduced to risk was when I joined a company called Bombardier, a Canadian company, and I got the role of Director of Project Risk Management, and that gave me a good insight and understanding of risk and how you identify risk and how you mitigate risk. So that's one of the kind of core skill sets that I would say I have in the way that I work, in the way that I run a business now.
Right, and from that then, you then started to take on more senior roles. What were the sort of roles that you took on, and how did you take this experience with you?
I think it just evolved. So when I left Bombardier, I decided I wanted to work for myself. So I went into consultancy. And then I picked up a couple of pieces of work, but probably the one that took me, I'd say, closest to risk was when I started with the rail operator. Again, I was responsible for putting projects and all the capital projects with the rail operator. So project risk management was a core part of what we did there, especially in such a safety-conscious industry as the railway. And then my career took me to airports. So I got engagement to work at Edinburgh Airport. And there I wasn't doing so much risk. The first thing that I kind of focused on there was strategy. But I see strategy and risk as in some ways very similar because they both deal with uncertainty. To me, risk is uncertainty management, and to an extent strategy is as well. Although with strategy you tend to look for the opportunities, and with risk you're tending to look for what are the uncertainties that could cause a downside to the business.
Absolutely. The effect of uncertainty objectives, that's what comes out through the international standards. And that's where we first met each other, where I was a head of risk, reporting into the managing director that we know well, Gordon Stewart, a great director to work alongside with and work for. And got to know you better and sort of developing and linking the risk into the strategy you're developing. So that's when we first worked together in detail, which was great. And then you evolved. We did hopefully a very good job at Edinburgh Airport. It achieved many awards, achieved many international standards at all sorts of areas and aspects of customer service. Every area we improved upon, and then the sales process happened, and that's when GIP was buying over. So again, that was a very interesting period for myself because I was allowed to maintain there and involved in the transition and the due diligence. So that was great. And then you had the opportunity to move over to another airport, Bahrain Airport.
Yep. So I think we were discussing earlier, in many ways, that was probably the biggest personal risk that I've ever taken, where I moved to the Middle East with a young family. So it was a big unknown. There's that word uncertainty again. It was an airport in the Middle East in a country I'd never lived in. I had 3 young children, but we took that risk or opportunity. Is it an opportunity or is it a risk? It depends on how you look at it. So we viewed it as an opportunity, and we moved out there. But again, just when we were chatting earlier, I talked about what I did to mitigate that risk, which was at the time I was working in my own consultancy, management consultancy, which I was effectively leaving. But I stayed on as a director and discussed with my fellow directors that I would do that for a period of 6 months, just to make sure that everything worked out in the Middle East okay. So my mitigation plan for this potential risk was to stay attached to the business, that if things didn't work out, then I had something to fall back on. So yeah, that was kind of biggest personal risk. But I think during the time that I was there, probably about 2 or 3 years, I was there for 9 years, so it actually turned into a fantastic opportunity. It wasn't a risk. Well, it was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. By the time that I was there, probably one of the most interesting exposures that I came to across in terms of risk and business continuity was to be part of the senior management team. So I was the chief officer for support services out there. So I had finance and IT were probably two of the most risk sensitive parts of the business that were reporting to me. And we engaged a consultancy to come in and to put in a risk and business continuity process into the business. And that was fascinating. It was fascinating for me as a former risk practitioner to be on the receiving end of a risk consultant rather than to be the risk consultant. And what was fascinating there was the two stages of that process. There was the initial assessment phase that the consultants did with each of the heads of business to identify what were the major risks within the business, because essentially as a senior management team, we didn't know at that point, and we didn't know the collective and the interactive nature of the different risks that we had. So that was interesting, and in fact, if memory serves me correct, from an IT perspective, it identified that one of the biggest risks that I had was we only had a single data line supply chain into the airport from the local network provider or telecoms provider. So we had to put in that we had duplicity, so that if that line get cut for roadworks or whatever, then we had a backup plan in place. So that was very, very useful. The second phase that was very interesting from that was actually was not just doing that exercise as a one-off, but putting in as part of the management system, the risk management and business continuity. It was in the form of monthly meetings. So we then had to keep a track of progress against the mitigating actions against each of the major risks that were identified in that initial exercise. So that was a big piece of work and a very valuable piece of work at Bahrain Airport.
Good, and that's the riskiest thing that you've done effectively. And going through that process, you encountered lots of difficulties and overcome them. But what was the driver? What got you out of bed in the morning? What makes you resilient to continue through all that?
What makes me get out of bed in the morning? I think personally, I like to be. Once you're in charge of the risks of the business, you're more proactively in charge. If you don't have that visibility of them, then you're reactively in charge. You're a firefighter. You get some senior managers in businesses that pride themselves on their firefighting skills. Personally, I'm a bit suspicious of them, because that tells me that they're not. I like boredom, right? In business, I like things to be calm, and so I like to understand what are my big risks, and then how are we proactively managing them. You will always get issues in a business. I just like them to be smaller, and the reason that you can end up with smaller issues, smaller fires, is if you're proactively managing risk. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is to get myself where I'm running a business that's proactively a lot more in control.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. And that's what risk management is about. It's about getting on the front foot. And you mentioned earlier, what is risk? Is it threats or risk? But when we look at it, when we develop these conversations in our training, we very much see risk as the umbrella, with opportunity and threat very much part of that. The upside, the downside of risk, the positive, the negative, and certainly maximising the opportunities and minimising the threats. So risk is a much more holistic looking at, and again, aligning that to helping deliver and align to the strategies and reduce that uncertainty, so you don't have fires, you don't have crisis going on. You can manage that, but clearly we need to be thinking about the continuity aspects of that all the way through. So you had a lot to look at when you went out to the Middle East and developed and matured their systems for a number of years. And as it matured, how important do you see structure, high-level structures, management systems, we could call it, integrated risk and resilience approaches to understand and have structure across the whole organisation, all the departments, from airside to HR to however? What's the sort of things that you like to see in place to make it boring?
Well, I think what you're touching on a whole management system for me in a business. So when I go into a business, I look to see what is the overall management system, because that in itself is a risk. So do you have a KPI, kind of balanced scorecard type of format to be managing the business at different levels, at a top level, and then various different levels across? So is that balanced across the business? Do you have various different forums to manage, whether it's capital projects, operational issues, customer service issues, financial status of the business. It's that, again, that management system, that kind of infrastructure within a business is extremely important. And if you've got gaps in that, then that for me is a issue / risk. But part of that complete management system is actually having some form of risk and business continuity talked about. The exercise that I talked about in Bahrain that we did, we were only able to do that after a number of years because we had to take the company to a certain degree of maturity, because we had quite a number of issues that we were dealing with. So you've really got to deal with the issues. First of all, it's not, risk is about, once you get to a certain stage of maturity, you bring that into your business. Hopefully most businesses are at that stage, but sometimes they're not, and therefore you just need to focus on fixing the issues first of all. But to me, it's part of an integrated and what I call holistic and sustainable management system, is that you have risk as part of that conversation.
Absolutely. And the other key thing you mentioned there is customer focus. And airports are very customer focused. They're clear on who the passenger are, who the stakeholders are, and that's something that I've always, I know you focus on this particularly, but again, this is something that's coming through in financial sector, for example, at the moment through operational resilience, making sure that whatever organisation you are, that you have the customer in mind, you have who you're delivering your products and services to make sure you can reduce harm, you can increase customer satisfaction. And part of that is about thinking about the customer journey potentially through an airport as well, making sure that it is as safe and as secure and reliable and consistent all the way through. So do you think about the customer through that risk journey as well, through the different departments?
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to think of an example here. Again, when I was doing stuff in I'm talking about Bahrain again for some reason, but actually in finance, we did a lot of work with the finance department there, and it was actually on the finance department strategy. And when we formed that strategy, we looked at it from different stakeholders' perspectives. Right? So let's say, I don't know, the receivables process, just to pick an example. We looked at that from the customer's perspective. We looked at that from the board's perspective. We looked at it from the senior management's perspective. We looked at it from the employees that are using the processes perspective. And I think what you've touched on there by the customer is looking at things from different perspectives. And what we found was that when we looked at a service from the different perspectives, we found different things, we found different opportunities, and we found different risks. Right? So the receivables process is looked at differently depending on who you look at it from their perspective, right? So the customer, they see something completely different to what the board sees, but you can identify different risks within the same process just by taking that multi-dimensional stakeholder view as to what's going on in that process.
Absolutely, and I think from an enterprise risk point of view, that's what's supposed to get looked at from the whole business holistically, but then you can bring it down into each of the key areas and also the interaction and dependencies through that. So I think that's a really interesting area to develop. But I think that's a great example. Maybe if we can now move on to your most recent role, Chief Exec of Maldives Airport, building on the areas that you've talked about, building on your experiences. What do you do when you first step on the ground and you're now the CEO? You're in charge of that infrastructure, that important infrastructure for that country. What's the starting point, and how do you assess the capability of the people there? I suppose your new management team.
Yeah, good question. So I think when I go into any new business, I did it at Edinburgh Airport, I did it in Bahrain, and then latterly I did it in the Maldives. And what I'm looking at is the whole business dimensionally. The first thing I look at is financial risk, to be perfectly honest, because any commercial business needs money coming in and it needs to be profitable. That's what I call the oxygen of any business. And when I went out to the Maldives, it was just when COVID was taking place. So it wasn't risks, it was issues that we were dealing with, real live issues where we were at about 5% of our pre-COVID passenger numbers. So aviation sector completely decimated. So the biggest issue I had there was cash flow and looking at how we recovered. But what I do is an assessment of the business. So I've got a particular, if you like, a sort of business interrogation or business assessment tool that I use with mind maps and interviewing my senior management and the board. And I ask them a series of questions about the business. And I'm interested in customers, I'm interested in the structural elements, which is processes, systems, IT, meeting structure, KPIs. I want to know what's there. I also ask the staff, tell me what are your issues, what are your top 3 issues? Tell me what your top 3 risks. That question, I'm trying to find out whether they've got risk management exists within the thought process. Because to me, the biggest risk in a business is if I ask my management team, what's your top 3 risks, and they don't know, then that by itself is the biggest risk. And I need to then at some point educate them in risk management and get a risk management system in place, similar to what we did in Bahrain. So that's the kind of methodology that I approach, is trying to assess where that business is. But in the immediacy term in the Maldives, due to COVID, risk wasn't the sort of priority. However, I didn't exclude it. One of the areas I was able to take the learnings from Bahrain, and because I'd seen a number of risks identified. So one of the risks we identified in Bahrain was if an aircraft, touch wood, crashed and blocked the runway. We didn't have aircraft removal capability, and effectively the entire airport is shut if an aircraft is distressed and stuck in the middle of a runway. So I realised that was a risk that existed in both airports, and we did work in both airports to kind of mitigate that quite quickly, because that for me is the extremely low probability but massively high impact type of a risk if you're using the classic 3x3 or 4x4 matrix. So you don't just exclusively ignore risks. So while we had what I felt were quite a number of issues due to COVID in the Maldives, I wasn't excluding risk from my thought process, because it's kind of in my DNA, because I spent so long doing it in Bombardier, where I was the director of project risk for quite a while.
Oh, great, really interesting. And again, your insight from your management team gives you so much insight into where the maturity is. Maybe one more question before we move into high-level reporting, the types of information that you like to see coming through from the management team. But because airports and a lot of the businesses and areas that we've worked in together, critical national infrastructure, relies so heavily on the assets, on capital investment, on the assets that make the organisation run, the asset from the terminal to the runways. How much focus early on, or is it a little bit further on when you start to get an insight into where the capability of the assets are, where the maturity of it is? Are they actually able to operate as they should do? How do you get an insight into the key assets of what you're overseeing?
That's a good question. Again, I would probably, I'll give my example back to Bahrain, because I was there for 9 years, so I went through the journey, and so it's more kind of appropriate. But you basically start off by doing an asset condition assessment, and that was what was done. So actually, when I arrived in Bahrain, that asset condition assessment had been conducted by an independent engineering consultant. So we had a survey of the condition of the asset itself, and that's extremely important on any asset-intensive business, because that in itself, that identifies both issues and risks with the assets. So you've got current issues that need to get fixed, and then there's the potential issues that are risky going forward. And then you just need to work out prioritising the spend on that asset base. And you're also making a judgment call as to whether you repair or replace, right? So does the runway, as an example, can you patch it and just do minor repairs that will give you another 5 years life out of the runway, or do you need to do an entire runway replacement, right down to individual components, whether it's AC systems or whatever exists within a building asset infrastructure.
Oh, brilliant. And such an important part, isn't it? Because these are the things that can fail, cause continuity issues, and often the area that can cause harm to people as well if they're not properly maintained. So yeah, key area. So maybe just sort of finishing off then, thinking about the types of information at CEO level feeding into the board. What's the sort of type of information that you like reported up to you, and how do you communicate that back down both ways? What's the style? What's the approach that you take?
I think what I'm looking for is each of my senior managers to demonstrate that they understand the risk within their own part of the business. You know, a very simple question you can ask is, what are your top 3 risks? Right. So my VP of Finance, what's the top 3 financial risks? Or operations, what's your top 3 operational risks? You know, right across the whole board, right across the whole gambit, procurement or customer service or commercial. And if they can answer that question, then I start to feel relaxed. If they can't answer that question, then I'm less relaxed, because it tells me that they don't truly at depth understand their business, and they're not thinking forward. Risk management is about thinking ahead. It's about thinking forward. And the higher up in a business you go, the more forward thinking, the more strategic thinking you should be doing. So you should be more focused on this. If you're just dealing with the day-to-day issues and operational transactions, then you're operating at the wrong level. So the further up a company you go, the more forward thinking you should be with your approach. In terms of specifically how I like risks reported to me, I am very specific here, and that's because of the time that I spent doing the job of a risk director for 3 years previously, and I like a risk to be written down that it's very clearly understood. What I come across time and time again is risk warble, where there's just write something down and it actually doesn't make any sense. And so first of all, if I have to ask the question, what does that mean? That's an alarm bell going off straight in my head. What I like is a nice clear statement that says there is a risk, that, and it describes what the risk is. I like as part of that paragraph to be, and the risk is caused by, and I like them to demonstrate that they understand what the cause of the risk is. And then I further like them, the management team, to demonstrate to me what the direct impact of that risk is.
Yeah, right? So why are we bothered about it? Yeah.
Right. Then what I like to see is, okay, what are you doing about it? And I like to see the mitigating actions that correlate directly to the cause, and say, oh, because this cause or causes, multiple causes exist for this risk, here are the mitigating actions that we're going to do against each of these causes. Or if you can do something about the cause, then there's a series of mitigating actions on the impact on what they're going to do. And that's very structured, right? And it's very logical, but as I say, that comes from my time working in risk. But it demonstrates to me whether they clearly understand it. And unfortunately, I would say the majority of times, in my experience, people don't understand and they get confused and they're a bit going round in circles. So as a senior manager, I'm trying to ask questions to help bring clarity to their mind so that they truly understand what are the risks within their business.
Brilliant point and key, and this is something that we spend a fair amount of time on in the academy and the programs, making sure that the articulation of that risk, making sure it's communicated properly, not huge big paragraphs, not one word, not fire, but explaining it. Cause of, risk due to, importance.
It's so important, right? I mean, I put in a project risk management system in Bombardier when I worked there many years ago, the train manufacturer, and we did that globally. And I remember one of the directors asking me, you put in we bought a system to manage it on. We ran all these training courses, and we used some software. There was a whole load of different things that we did. And they said, what's, out of everything you've done, what's the most important thing? And I said, the most important thing is getting individuals to clearly articulate what a risk is, what causes it, what the direct impact is, and then correlate the mitigating actions. In many ways, I'm not interested in the risk. That might sound strange. I'm more interested in what are the mitigating actions, right? Because if a company and an organisation spends time creating a risk register, they spend time writing down a list of risks, they spend time writing down mitigating actions, and they do nothing after that, then all they've done is cost money to the company at a tremendous scale. The point where you add value is when you close a mitigating action and then you've reduced the level of risk that the company is exposed to. It's closing mitigating actions is where the focus really needs to be within risk management and business continuity.
Absolutely, and just doing something about it, because, like you say, huge effort, huge time, training, software, the effort of doing it, the effort of actually finding out where it is, but actually in the risk management process, it's a context, identify, analyse, evaluate, but actually treat it and communicate with the people, because sometimes as well, the problem that I see sometimes is that they put huge amounts of effort in if it's quite new, and then there's a plethora of risks. Where do you start? But that's what risk management is about. It's about prioritising and actually doing something about it. And one of the things I'm just thinking now, back to time with Gordon, was that he was very pragmatic about it and said, right, well, actually just focus on 2 or 3 key things and sort it out. And actually, if you don't do that, those 10 things, none of them get sorted out. So I think a focus on priority, obviously, through the risk process, but actually do it. And often you need resources and support to be able to do that. But I think that's a good area to close on, and such a fantastic insight from yourself. And really appreciate all your thoughts and information. It's been very useful, and I'm sure very useful for many types of people, including risk managers, because often they ask us, what is it that CEOs want? What is it that boards want? And everybody's slightly different, but I think you gave a really clear view that would help a lot of people. So much appreciated. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I think just to kind of close on that as well, what does the CEO want? I want to know what the big risks are, and I want to see that the mitigating actions are being closed to reduce the size of the risk that the business has been exposed to. That, in a nutshell, is what you're looking for.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're very welcome, Grant.